Ready to go deep on Lovecraftian games. Awesome. We've got a whole bunch of Steam reviews for 3 games, and each one kind of puts its own spin on the whole Lovecraftian thing. So today, what we really want to do is figure out what makes a good Lovecraftian game. What are the things that really nail that sense of cosmic dread?
Oh, yeah.
Are there any big missteps that kind of pull you out of the whole experience?
It's a tough thing to get right, isn't it? To really capture that feeling of existential horror and the vastness of everything and how small we are in comparison.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so first up is I'm on Observation Duty 3. It came out back in 2020, developed and published by Notovia, and it's got a pretty solid 79% positive reviews on Steam.
I think what's really interesting about this one is the change in perspective.
Yeah.
So unlike the earlier games in the series where, you're kind of safe behind your security cameras, Observation Duty 3 puts you right there in the action with a first-person view. You're actually walking around these creepy places, holding the camera yourself.
Yeah, and that seems to be what people are talking about the most in the reviews. Some players are totally loving the how much more immersive it is, and that feeling of vulnerability as you're going through those dark hallways. It really kicks up the fear factor. But then there are others who, well, they say they miss that kind of detached safety of those static cameras.
It's it makes sense when you think about it, that primal fear of the unknown, right? When you're forced to face something head on, it's always way scarier than just seeing it on a screen.
Yeah, totally. Some people even said they felt physically sick because of how immersive it was. They were even joking about having weak bloodlines, which is a pretty great Lovecraftian reference if you ask me. But then you've also got a lot of complaints about the technical side of things, no crosshair, limited field of view. It makes it a pain to actually do stuff in the game world. Apparently trying to open some of those low doors is a real struggle.
That raises a good question then, does it? Does that clunkiness actually make it scarier? Like you're more powerless, fumbling around in the dark? Or does it just take you out of it?
Exactly. Is that intentional or just bad game design? We've got to figure out if those design choices are adding to the Lovecraftian atmosphere, or are they just making the game a pain to play?
If you think about it, those FOV limitations, they could be mimicking how Lovecraft's characters see the world. They're always struggling to understand what they're looking at. So maybe that limited view is putting you in their shoes.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. It's the game forces you to experience that world through this cosmic horror lens, where you can never fully grasp what's going on.
Right, and that struggle to actually interact with things. It could be a way to make you feel vulnerable, just like those investigators in Lovecraft's stories. They're always at the mercy of these powerful forces.
That's a cool way to look at it. So maybe even stuff that seems kind of bad at first can actually add to the Lovecraftian feel if it's done right.
Exactly. It all comes down to how it's used.
Okay, let's move on to a different game now. Sea Salt. It came out in 2019. YCJY is the developer. And this one flips the script entirely. You're not some scared investigator this time. You're the one bringing the cosmic horror. You play as a Dagon, the vengeful sea god, commanding a horde of Lovecraftian creatures, just wreaking havoc on humanity.
Talk about a power trip. It's so interesting how they flip that typical Lovecraftian story. Instead of being the victim, you get to be the source of the horror.
And the reviews are mostly positive, but you see some pretty different opinions about how the game actually plays. Some people love the strategy, carefully managing your resources, getting those close victories when your horde is almost wiped out.
Oh yeah, there's definitely something thrilling about that. The idea that even this unstoppable force can be whittled down, that even a god has to worry about running out of resources, it adds a whole other level of tension, even though you're the big bad guy.
Totally. There's this one review that said it perfectly. Being on your last legs. Snatching victory from defeat. But then not everyone's loving the gameplay. Some are saying it gets repetitive, too easy, or too hard, depending on how well you manage your resources. And then there's this gem. The Sorcerer Apostle is best cusp beholders are OP.
That's great. Always got to find that OP combo. Yeah. But that does bring up an important question. Is Sea Salt really Lovecraftian? Or is it just a strategy game with a Lovecraftian theme slapped on it?
Right. Does playing as the source of the horror, does that actually take away from that feeling of dread and powerlessness? Isn't that a huge part of the genre?
Yeah, it's a good point. On the surface, all that action might seem kind of opposite to those Lovecraftian themes of how insignificant humans are. But, Lovecraft stories do often have these powerful cosmic beings in them.
Right. So is it more about how we see that power, the perspective?
Exactly. Sea salt lets you, for a little while at least, be that cosmic entity. You wield that immense power. But then the game cleverly makes you vulnerable through, managing those resources. As your horde starts to shrink, that godlike power starts to fade. It's almost like watching one of those Lovecraftian creatures fall.
Okay, yeah. I'm seeing the nuances now. It's not just about if you're strong or not. It's about how the game makes you feel about that power.
Exactly. And that potential loss of control. Always needing to rebuild your forces. That could tap into a deeper, more unsettling kind of Lovecraftian dread. The kind that slowly creeps in, whispering that even gods aren't safe from fate.
Wow, that's a really thought-provoking way to put it. It's not just about tentacles and monsters. It's about that feeling of cosmic indifference, right? That even the strongest beings are just pawns in a much bigger game.
Exactly. That's where the true horror lies.
So you've got one game where you're vulnerable, just trying to survive, and another one where you're powerful but always facing that threat of losing it all. It's fascinating how both tie back to that core feeling of Lovecraftian dread.
It really shows how versatile the genre can be, and all the different ways developers can create that cosmic horror feel.
For sure. Okay, well, let's move on to our third game, Meridian 157, Chapter 3. It's the final chapter in a point-and-click puzzle adventure series.
Released in 2021 by Novasoft Interactive Ltd., Meridian 157, Chapter 3 has gotten overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. Players are really loving it.
And the praise is pretty consistent, too. People are raving about the atmosphere, saying it's peaceful and retro, like the perfect setting for the mystery that unfolds. They also really like the puzzles. They say they're logical, challenging, but in a good way, and super satisfying to solve.
That's interesting, isn't it? It makes you think that maybe a more cerebral approach, focusing on intellectual engagement instead of just adrenaline, can also work for Lovecraftian fans. Slowly unraveling a mystery, piece by piece. That can be just as unsettling as being chased by a Shoggoth.
Totally. And the story itself seems to be a big draw. A lot of reviewers mention how gripping it is and how it leaves things open to interpretation, that ambiguity, all those unanswered questions. It really seems to click with fans of Lovecraft's style.
It's an essential part of it, isn't it? Lovecraft's stories, they often leave you with more questions than answers. And that lingering mystery, that's what fuels the horror. It lets your imagination go wild, filling in the blanks with your own nightmares.
Sure. But even with all this praise, the game still has its quirks. Some players complain about technical issues with the cutscenes, and others have trouble with certain puzzles. They say they're unfathomable without using hints.
That just shows how tricky it is for developers, doesn't it? Finding that balance between making it challenging and accessible. A puzzle that's too obscure can be super frustrating, especially in a genre that relies so much on atmosphere and immersion.
Absolutely. You don't want players getting all frustrated when they should be feeling that creeping sense of dread. Oh, and there's one review that really stood out to me. One player says they love this game because it's, wait for it, sleep-inducing. Apparently, Meridian 157 is the perfect game to wind down with before bed.
That's amazing. It just shows you how differently people can experience games, right?
Yeah.
What one person finds scary, another finds relaxing.
Maybe it's that peaceful atmosphere.
Or maybe it's all those brain-twisting puzzles finally wearing them out.
Yeah, that's true. But it does make you wonder, can a game that some people find sleep-inducing still be considered a good Lovecraftian game? Or does it need to keep you on the edge of your seat, heart-pounding, to really capture that cosmic horror?
That's a great question to think about. As we move into the next part of our deep dive, we've talked about these three games, each with its own take on Lovecraftian themes. But how well do they actually do it? Are they missing anything crucial? We'll dig into those questions next. It's pretty amazing how these games try to take Lovecraft's cosmic horror, something that's supposed to be beyond our understanding, and turn it into a game.
Right. You have to give players enough information so they know what they're dealing with, but you don't want to explain everything or you'll lose that sense of mystery and dread. It's a tough balance to strike.
Absolutely. And that's where the mechanics of the game really come into play. Let's go back to I'm on Observation Duty 3 for a second. Remember those complaints about the clunky controls?
Oh, yeah, those low doors, right. Some players were really annoyed by them.
Exactly. But what if that clunkiness, that struggle to interact with things, was intentional? Maybe it's a way to make you feel more vulnerable, more like those Lovecraftian characters who are always fumbling around in the dark, literally and figuratively.
I see what you're saying. It's like the game is purposely limiting what you can do, making you feel powerless against these cosmic horrors.
Exactly. And think about the level design. Players talked about feeling claustrophobic and lost. What if those tight spaces and confusing layouts are meant to make you feel even more vulnerable? It's a subtle way to bring in that classic Lovecraftian theme of being trapped in a situation you don't understand.
And don't forget about the limited resources. You have to keep an eye on your camera's battery life, which adds another level of stress to the game.
Right. That constant worry about your camera dying and leaving you in the dark, it taps into that primal fear of the unknown. It's a really smart way to use game mechanics to create a very specific kind of dread.
Okay, so even things that seem like bad design, like clunky controls or limited resources, can actually contribute to that Lovecraftian atmosphere, if they're done on purpose, that is.
Exactly. It's all about how those elements work together to create a complete and immersive experience. But let's switch gears for a bit and talk about sea salt. We were discussing whether playing as the source of the horror actually weakens the feeling of dread.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about that one. It seems counterintuitive, considering the whole point of Lovecraftian horror.
It does, doesn't it? But think about the mechanics of summoning and controlling those hordes. What if those mechanics were designed to reflect that kind of psychological manipulation that you often see in Lovecraft's stories?
Ooh, interesting. So instead of just mindlessly sending creatures to attack, you could be corrupting their minds, turning them against each other, driving them to do horrible things.
Exactly. Imagine being able to infiltrate human settlements,
Yeah.
turning them against each other, driving them to violence and self-destruction. You would add a whole new layer to the strategy, making you feel like a truly insidious Lovecraftian entity.
That's a really cool idea. It would take the game beyond just conquering and destroying. It would tap into that more subtle, psychological side of Lovecraftian horror, the kind that slowly gets to you, makes you question your own sanity.
And it would fit perfectly with Lovecraft's fascination with the corrupting influence of ancient knowledge and forbidden powers. The game could even include things like ritualistic sacrifice or summoning otherworldly entities to make it feel even more Lovecraftian.
Okay, I'm totally on board with this. Sea salt could really level up with additions like that. It would make you feel like you're really embodying that cosmic horror instead of just commanding an army.
Precisely. It's about going deeper than the surface, tapping into those psychological and thematic elements that make Lovecraftian horror so captivating.
All right, so we've got I'm on Observation Duty 3 using limitations and vulnerability to create dread, and we've got Sea Salt potentially exploring that corrupting influence of power. What about Meridian 157? How does a puzzle game fit into all of this?
Meridian 157 is great at atmosphere and mystery, but I think it could benefit from engaging more directly with Lovecraftian lore. Imagine if those puzzles were infused with elements of the mythos.
Oh, I like where you're going with this. So instead of just generic puzzles, you'd be deciphering ancient texts, piecing together fragments of forbidden knowledge, maybe even performing rituals to unlock hidden areas.
Exactly. Think about the impact of solving a puzzle that's based on Lovecraftian symbols and rituals. It would create a much deeper connection to the source material, immersing you in that world of cosmic horror.
It's like the puzzles themselves become a way to unravel the mysteries of the mythos, to slowly uncover the true nature of the threat you're facing.
And that sense of discovery, that gradual unveiling of forbidden knowledge, that can be incredibly unsettling. It taps into that classic Lovecraftian fear of the unknown, the idea that some knowledge is best left buried.
Right. It's like the more you learn, the closer you get to going insane.
Exactly. And the game could even incorporate sanity mechanics, where solving certain puzzles or uncovering certain truths negatively affects your character's mental state.
Ooh, that's a cool idea. It would add a whole new level of tension and challenge, making you wonder if it's really worth seeking knowledge if it means losing your mind.
And it would perfectly reflect those themes of cosmic horror, where the pursuit of knowledge often leads to madness and despair.
So we've seen how these three games, even though they're very different, can all tap into those core elements of Lovecraftian horror, the feeling of being vulnerable, the corrupting influence of power, and the terrifying pursuit of forbidden knowledge.
Absolutely. But the question remains, how effectively do they achieve this? Are there any missed opportunities, any areas where they could have pushed the boundaries even further? That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Back again for more Lovecraftian gaming. So we've been talking about how these games try to make cosmic horror something you can actually play. But it's got me thinking, what really makes a Lovecraftian game great? Is it enough to just nail the atmosphere and throw in a few tentacles here and there? Or is there like more to it than that?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've seen some pretty clever design choices, but are these games really doing everything they can with Lovecraft's ideas? Or are they missing opportunities to make these experiences even more, well, unsettling, even more mind-bending?
Right. Like we were talking about how Observation Duty 3 uses those clunky controls and the limited resources to make you feel vulnerable. But is there a point where that just becomes annoying instead of scary? Could they have made those parts better without making the game less scary?
Yeah, it's a tough balance to get right. Imagine if they pushed that feeling of disorientation even further. What if the environment itself started changing as you explored it, like it was messing with your perception? Hallways getting longer or shorter, rooms rearranging themselves. It would make you question what was real.
Whoa, that would be super trippy. It's like the game world itself becomes part of the horror, always reminding you that you're not really in control.
Exactly. And think about the sound design, too. They could play with your expectations there, using subtle distortions, creepy whispers, that kind of thing. Imagine hearing these faint, almost unintelligible voices at the edge of your hearing, or these sudden shifts in pitch and volume that make you wonder if you're going crazy.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely getting into creepy territory. It's the game is messing with your head, making you doubt your own senses.
Right. It's about using every part of the game to make it a truly unsettling experience, something that stays with you even after you turn it off.
And what about sea salt? We were talking about how it could use psychological manipulation, letting you corrupt and control whole towns. But could it take that even further? Could it really tap into that Lovecraftian fear of the unknown, that cosmic dread?
Definitely. What if they added in elements of ritual and sacrifice? Like, you could tap into forbidden powers that make your hordes stronger, but those powers start to corrupt your own creatures too. They twist and mutate into something even more monstrous, something you start to fear, even as the player.
That's wild. It's like the power you're using is turning against you, becoming a reflection of that cosmic horror you're unleashing on the world.
Exactly. And imagine the world itself changing because of what you do. The landscape warping and twisting, the sky turning these unnatural colors. It would be like a visual representation of the corruption you're spreading.
So it's not just about winning battles, it's about leaving a scar on the world, you know? A reminder of the terrible power you've unleashed.
Precisely. It's about making the player feel like a true agent of cosmic horror, like they have the power to change reality itself.
Okay, that's taking things to a whole other level. But what about Meridian 157? We were saying it could use more Lovecraftian lore in its puzzles, but how would that actually work in the game?
Well, picture this. You find these ancient texts that talk about these powerful cosmic entities, but their names and powers are written in this cryptic language. And the puzzles are all about deciphering those texts, uncovering bits of forbidden knowledge that slowly reveal the true nature of the danger you're facing.
Ooh, that's a cool idea. So solving the puzzles becomes like a journey into Lovecraftian lore, pulling you deeper and deeper into that world of cosmic horror.
Right. And what if solving those puzzles meant you had to do certain things in the game world, like performing rituals or interacting with weird artifacts? You could have to arrange items in patterns based on Lovecraftian symbols, or chant phrases from those forbidden texts to open up hidden areas.
It's like the game is blurring the line between what's real and what's in the game, making you feel like you're actually part of these rituals, summoning these forces you don't even understand.
Exactly. And those actions could have consequences, but in a subtle way. Maybe your character starts seeing things, having nightmares. It would show the mental toll of messing with forbidden knowledge. And maybe even the game world itself starts glitching out, showing how unstable reality becomes when you're dealing with cosmic horror.
So it's not just about solving the puzzles, it's about how they mess with your mind, you know, making you doubt what's real and chipping away at your sanity.
Exactly. It's about using every single part of the game's design to create an experience that's truly unsettling and memorable, something that leaves you with this lingering feeling of cosmic dread long after you put the controller down.
So we've seen how all three of these games, even though they're very different, can get at those core ideas of Lovecraftian horror. That feeling of vulnerability, the corrupting influence of power, and the terrifying draw of forbidden knowledge.
And we've talked about ways they could push those boundaries even further, creating experiences that are even more disturbing and thought-provoking.
It seems like the key is to go deeper than just the surface level, to use everything a game developer has to create an experience that feels real and complete, one that truly captures what Lovecraft was all about.
It's about making the player feel small and insignificant compared to these vast, unknowable forces. It's about creating that sense of unease, that creeping dread that stays with you even after the game is over.
It's a reminder that we're just tiny little things in this huge and indifferent universe, vulnerable to powers we can't even comprehend.
And maybe, just maybe, it's about finding a strange kind of beauty in that cosmic horror, a sense of awe and wonder in the face of the unknown.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into the world of Lovecraftian games. We've seen the good, the bad, and the potentially mind-blowing. Which game really stuck with you? What parts of Lovecraftian horror do you find the most interesting? Let us know in the comments. Maybe we'll take a deep dive into your favorite Lovecraftian games next. Until then, keep exploring those depths, but be careful what might be lurking down there.